I ran social services for 20 years, and the system is set up that as you work and you do better, the resources go away. As I was getting older, that contradiction just didn't sit right with me. My parents were living in Mexico, and my mother decided that to have a better life, that you had to come to America, and if you worked hard, you'd get the American dream. My mother sacrificed everything so that I could get into college. She worked 2 jobs, and like so many people that come to work really hard, nobody would invest in her. Nobody would trust her. I provided social services and tried to help people like my family for 20 years. All that existed was a social service program that was patronizing. My mother would never accepted that kind of help. The mayor of Oakland, who is now the governor of California, Jerry Brown, called me up and said, if you could do anything you wanted to do and you really wanted to have an impact on poverty, what would you do? I realized I didn't know what to do, but my mother figured out what to do to get me out. And for that fact, I think most mothers, fathers, guardians would have a better idea how to get their own families out. So I started the Family Independence Initiative. I started collecting data from hundreds of families and found out maybe my mother's not so unique. This initiative was set up to really find out what the capacity was of families to actually help themselves, and would they be willing to help each other.
What Mauricio is saying is, I believe in the track record of these families, and I'm going to invest small amounts of capital that they'll deploy according to their own sense. And then he's just tracking the data to see how they make those investments.
One thing I like about it, he's not doing nothing for you, but he's showing you you can do this all by yourself. We're just providing you the resources to do so. Everything that I've wanted to do, I've always just sat back thinking about it. Mauricio has literally made me jump. Yes, this is very good and healthy, Vanya. You did such a great job with that cookie.
For me, the biggest transformation has been to really step back and just be supportive or helpful and encouraging of what other people do. The power of change is embedded in these communities. For us, it really is, can you make visible what nobody sees?
Watching your ideas and what you do, that's what inspires me, so thank you.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Lenny Steinhorn, the one without the video. And I did want to ask Mauricio, based on his story, you are clearly somebody with your feet firmly rooted in the community, but your eyes soaring for inspiration from the people. So tell me about those 3 young women here and how they spoke to you and what they say about the work that you do on a regular basis.
So, you know, we don't prep for I don't prep for these things anymore. And so a lot of it is just kind of listening to Veronica, Cynthia, Karen, and wondering what I wanted to say. What stood out to me is I want to push this narrative change just one step further. So, you know, my mother is she's a single mom, Mexican, and 3rd grade education. And my sister was getting in trouble up here. She got pregnant at 16, and all the stereotypes of lazy Mexicans and whatever kind of overlaid on her and our family, and she really hated that. She wanted to be seen for what she really was, which was she was a really wonderful designer and amazing seamstress and really hard worker, and she was actually good at math, and that's how I saw her. 'Cause I'd see her, you know, at night. She'd walk by a dress shop and see a dress, and she said, you know, I could sell that for a quarter of the price and still make money. And so she'd start drawing it on newspapers with crayons, and she could do any size just from her head. I mean, this was an intuitive, you know, we all have talents, but nobody saw her that way. They saw her as stereotypes, and then they saw all the problems and all the needs. So I'm going to come back to, you know, the feeling I got when I was listening to the 3 of you. I went, somehow or other, everything was sacrificed, and by some fluke, I ended up, well, my mother told me I had to be a doctor and engineer, so there was like no choice. You know, I had to make money for the family. So I ended up at UC Berkeley. the fascinating thing is, and I even saw it now, when I tell people I graduated as an engineer from UC Berkeley, I get instant credibility. And then when I'd go home to Sacramento with my mother in the neighborhood, I was considered dumb lazy. Yeah, it was just like the most fascinating thing, how that validation. And what I noticed is that, that the people graduating from Berkeley, and even when I was there, I didn't share that sometimes we didn't eat, and I didn't share, immigration problems. I didn't share any of that. Actually, because I graduated from Berkeley, nobody cared about that. All they cared about is what I could contribute to society. Was I going to be a good engineer for Douglas Aeronautics or whatever? That's what they asked. And rich people never share their problems. They have a lot of kids with drugs and whatever. That they never share that. Everybody just asks them the other side, and that's what my mother always wanted. So when you asked me about, when I was listening to all this, what really struck me is that I still don't know the talents that all three of you have and what you can contribute to society. Because our narratives are still set up to look at the problems we've had, but rich people don't do that. And that's how they get these opportunities. So to me, it's like, Cynthia, you're a programmer, and I wonder what you're going to produce. And Veronica, I don't know exactly what you're really good at, but I know you have talents. And, again, I don't know that, and that's what I should know. And so what you saw in the video is really that that's all my work for the last 17 years is like every time I walk by somebody and there's a stereotype on them that I think, but, seriously, I'm not all that bright. I was a C-minus student in engineering. People would have died if I built bridges, So to me, like all these folks that I'm around, they're like smarter than me.
Well, let's just talk a little bit more about that. You talk about stereotypes. We need narratives to counteract and actually obliterate some of those stereotypes. What are those stereotypes that you see in some of your work, and how do they keep people from getting ahead? What do they do to the cultural and national dialogue or the community dialogue?
Well, I think one of the things is that, and you saw it obviously with Trump coming in, and it's not Trump per se, but what Trump brought up is that when you have troubles and you think your life is not going really great, you tend to want to blame it on somebody. And so what you saw is that, a lot of the reason people voted for Trump is that he blamed it on immigrants or women or people of color, and that there was an audience for that they wanted to blame it on somebody. And so it just really divides us. And so for me, it was really sickening because this is like the basis for all this conflict. This is the basis for, why we have a lot of these wars going on. And what we do is we pick an ethnicity or we pick a color, and then we say they're our problem. And part of the reason is that we never find out that, what Cynthia probably is going to program and develop is going to create jobs for some of those white male workers that feel like, she's at fault, that she's taking things away, and yet she could be the one that really is the one that employs them and employs their children. And we don't see each other as assets, when we're trying to blame each other. And I find that troubling at a very large scale because there was an event last night and Carrie was there, and we were talking about that in the world. I think it's like, I'm terrible at numbers. That's why I shouldn't have been an engineer. I think we have about 7.7 billion people, and about 6 billion of our world lives around poverty. That's like 75 to 80% of the people here that we don't know whether they would be a wonderful graphic designer or they would really be a great programmer and come up with the best app. And, we were at the home of Swanee Hunt, and her former husband was an amazing conductor. We don't know the musicians. We don't know the mathematicians. We don't know we don't know 3/4 of the population as well. How can you miss And what could we do if we recognize the talents, of all these people that can add so much, can actually employ people that are feeling like it's their fault. So I've, for me, it's like it's a really huge problem in terms of our attitude about each other.
Well, let me reflect off of that for just a moment, because some of those narratives are extremely powerful, and what we have to do is unpack some of these narratives to be able to get to a better space. When I heard the three young women, to me they were extraordinary people, but I'm going to follow it up with a phrase that I'm going to explain. Extraordinary people, but to me, ordinary Americans. Now, what do I mean by that? I had a conversation with a colleague the other night who's very progressive, and they were saying, how can I get these ideas out to ordinary Americans? I said, who do you mean by that? And they go, well, the people that Donald Trump got to vote for him in the election. I said, so they're your definition of ordinary Americans? I said, to me, ordinary Americans are everybody who is here being part of this American dream. And if we define ordinary Americans as just a single cohort, we reinforce the notion that there is an other outside of the American community, and therefore we don't have to embrace everyone and their experiences and their narratives into what we are actually doing. I recall this conversation with a recent immigrant, and we were talking, and I said, so what nationality are you? And he said, I'm Chinese. And I said, are you an American citizen? And he goes, yes. So I said, you're as American as anybody else. You're as American as somebody who can trace their family to the Mayflower. That's what being American is. And I think what we have to do is understand that larger sense of community that unites us. Veronica, you were talking about how we are all in this thing together, equal, share the same DNA. Well, that's exactly what being an American is that we are all in this thing together.
So, my hope is that we finally discover that it's a win-win if we see each other as people. All three of you were talking about that, and that we see each other as people that contribute to one another, because what I've seen succeed is when we all work together and when we help each other. It sounds really idealistic, but in a very real way, that I feel like I've seen that happen over and over, where entire communities have really been able to help themselves and one another. And this goes back to, the Irish coming after the potato famines in the mid-1800s and being totally discriminated against in Boston. And then they had to help each other, right? And they have to lend money to each other. And ultimately, they start breaking into police or construction, and they helped each other into those jobs. And then now you can't tell who's Irish and who's, are they Protestant or whatever? I don't know. Who's whatever. And so, I feel like our history has so much of both how we help ourselves and one another, and how that if we then start really doing well and our kids start doing well, how we then can become part of greater society. My mother did not really want any special programs. She would say, if they just give me a little bit of the money that they spend trying to help me, we would be so much better off. Yeah, and we spend $750 billion trying to help people. Sorry, my mother just needed a little bit. It was really hard to get through Berkeley. So, something like that. But they never saw her or even me, from the other side until I graduated. And so one of the things is that I feel like what I want to share before I leave is that how we look at people and how they pick up as to how we look at people, especially when we're trying to help them, will often dictate what you get back from them. Okay, so even in this discussion, it was, okay, so tell me, your immigration problems. And those are like really important because you need to understand that context. But that's not what defines people, right? So I and a friend visited Liberia last year, and we went through a bunch of different neighborhoods and different areas. And we went to this one place, and because you got two Americans visiting a country that was devastated by Ebola and a civil war, and there's no economy, and the government was really dysfunctional, you name it, that as we walked in, we saw about 50 people sitting in front wanting to talk to us, right? So we're trying to sneak into these places is like, no way. And so they had 3 chairs, the person that organized the thing, and then the 2 of us sitting in front. And so then they said, so, what they want to do is tell you about their lives. And so Tony and I were sitting up there. And so this woman stands up and she says, so, in the war, I lost my husband and we lost everything. And, we were run out of wherever. And then another woman stands up and, I saw I lost my husband and I lost my son and da-da-da. And then another woman stands up and I lost this and I lost that. And then a man stands up and says, so there's no opportunities for men. And so we're totally dependent on the women helping all of this. And so, I already lost my mother to suicide, my niece to drug overdose, my sister to cancer. And it's like, I've lived pity stories. I'm sick of pity stories. And I don't feel sorry for anybody that's alive because they've obviously done something to stay alive. And I feel like they're totally amazing to have survived the kind of shit that, goes on. So to me, I admire people. I don't feel sorry for them. So, if you're dying on the street, okay. But if you're doing something, you should be admired because I know rich kids that could never have survived what most of us have survived. So we're sitting there and Tony and I are like, we really didn't come to Liberia to hear this kind of stuff, right? And so we didn't know how to, you can't stop people from telling these stories. And we're like, how do we get out of this? And then it started to rain. Right. So all of a sudden we all had to run under this canopy. And so we're all crowded under this canopy and it allowed us a chance to restart the conversation. So we told everybody, so look, really what we're here about is that we really want to know what you're good at. How did you make it through a war? How did you make it? We know you lost husbands. We know all this happened. And yet here you are. Right. And this woman in this beautiful dress is, it had organized everything for us. So that's what we want to hear about. And so we turned to the woman who organized it and we asked her, so look, we know you have 2 or 3 kids. I forget how much it was. And so how are you supporting them? How are you able to feed them? And so she stops and all of a sudden she says, well, so you see this dress? I made it. It was beautiful, right? And I said, so, my mother wanted to be a dress designer and a seamstress. And my mother looking at this dress is like, geez. So it's like, so you designed it? And she said, yeah. And this is what you do? And she said, yeah. And so you're really talented? And it's like, yeah. And it's like, but what do you do? He says, well, I sell charcoal. I have to go when it's not raining and collect charcoal and sell it on the street. And I said, well, is that what you want to do? It's like, well, no. What would you want to do? It's like, well, I want to do this, right? Which is what my mother wanted. It's like, well, that is like totally. So then we asked the audience, so how many others of you really are really good seamstresses or dress designers or whatever? But 8 or a dozen hands went up. And I asked, well, have you ever talked to each other about that? Never. It was always about how are we going to survive, not about what we're doing and what we want to do to get ahead. And so then this woman was on the side and she was tugging on my sleeve. She said, I'm a really good baker. She was weird, whispering to me once the conversation shifted. And I said, so this woman says she's a really good baker. How many of you are really good bakers and cooks and want to do catering, whatever? And probably half a dozen hands went up and says, well, maybe you guys should talk and it's what you need and whatever, which is really what my work is now. It's like looking for people's talents and having them discover what to do with it. And so then, the conversation then took a life of its own, and Tony and I were not in the conversation anymore because now that they knew that they each were sharing different things that were really what their goals, they start talking with one another. Okay, so then we were leaving, and as we were leaving, we asked the woman who organized the get-together, which had mostly about 50 women and maybe 2 men. We asked her, so are there no men in the community? And she says, well, yeah. And I said, well, how come they weren't there? And she said, well, what we understand is American funders want to fund women. And so it was important for us to then, and that they fund because if you make them feel guilty enough, then they'll give us money. And so that's why the pity stories. So in Liberia, they figured out, you got Americans coming, we have to present ourselves in a certain way. And that's what they were trying to do. And we have to understand that how we approach communities is going to be what we get back, especially if you're in a privileged position. And so unless we change the narrative, how we actually interact with people, it's not going to work.
And so I want to toss it to everybody, but I also want to comment on what you were saying about admiring people. And I think that's so important. And the previous panel talked about success stories, but I'm going to flip it on its head for just a second and say, I also want to hear about the non-success stories and why. Because I think we have this unusual narrative in America called the American dream, which says, if you work hard, you will succeed. But the flip side of that suggests that if you haven't succeeded, therefore, you haven't worked hard. But there are lots of people who haven't succeeded who work hard every day, who struggle to get out of their circumstances. But our society has suggested that folks who haven't succeeded have a moral failing. And I think we have to change that narrative in a very fundamental sense, is to look at the struggle and not the success. Admire the work and the perseverance and not necessarily the end result, because so much of life is that journey, and we have to respect that journey, even if people don't accumulate that American dream at the end, because ultimately it's what people are doing that we have to admire. And so I think to some extent, changing that narrative of the American dream, that flip side, what it all means, and respecting the fact that people struggle against all sorts of obstacles and stereotypes and barriers. And if we just say it's all on you, then we are missing the larger story and the larger narrative of America and the world around us. So I think we have to rethink some very fundamental narratives that are central to our culture to be able to get us out of this political box that we're in that you were talking about earlier. I traveled in the Mississippi Delta a few years ago, and there are people who for generations have been working hard every day, sweating, doing their best. But what they face are systemic prejudices and stereotypes and laws that are often sort of the school to prison pipeline. If you do one thing wrong in school, guess what happens to you? And so I agree with you in concept, but in reality, in some of our places, what we have to recognize is that some of those obstacles to success are built in not into the individual, but into the society around them. And so for us to achieve that American dream, which I think we all want everybody to achieve, we have to make sure that we empower society to recognize some of those obstacles and to push against them in a very powerful way.
Yeah, and I kind of want to reiterate what you were saying in terms of the opposite of what happens. So one of the dilemmas we have is that I do believe everybody, in order to survive, especially under the kind of conditions that we're talking about, is working really hard. But the fact is that the gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing. The fact is that it isn't even about money. The fact is that greater and greater proportions of our population are feeling disenfranchised, not having control over their lives or their future, their children. That's what really counts, is not even just the money, is that sense of insecurity. And that sense of insecurity leads to the wars and everything that you're seeing, and the violence, and even though there are what I think are more, I think working hard and getting ahead in any kind of way is becoming more of an exception than the dream that I think it was. It was really fascinating that, to me, is that what I've seen is the communities that have gotten ahead and gotten to the point where they feel they have control over their lives, and they don't have to have a lot of money. Like you said, my mother would have been happy if it was just me succeeding, but watching her daughter, suffering as much as she did, and then the next generation also on drugs and overdosing and whatever. The fact is that the price that had to be paid in my family for me to succeed wasn't right. So no, I think that we're losing this work hard and you can succeed. I just don't think that, and it has a lot to do with our attitudes. And I do think it has a flip side to it, that then it is because it's your fault. And I see that in programs. I ran programs, social service programs, for 20 years, and we started with gang programs, and you have to tell me when to stop. But so one of the dilemmas that I had is that when I ran social service programs, because I was going to be a bad engineer, so I joined the War on Poverty instead. So the dilemma was that our society as a whole, if you are poor and you're an adult, you're not trusted. there are more programs for children and youth because we'll say, well, they're not spoiled by their crazy parents and whatever. And so I had 120 staff and $10 million budget, and we ran all kinds of programs. There was a woman who had 3 kids coming out of the war in Vietnam, and that she had struggled and got her kids to America through pirates and everything else. And when she arrived in America with her 3 kids looked at her as really being a hero. I mean, for all of that she was able to do because she lost her husband in the route. And then when her kids started showing up in my program, the reason was that her oldest son was being recruited into the gangs in San Francisco. And that her kid, when he came to my programs, was very respectful of my staff, right? And we took him to his first baseball game. We were able to give him school supplies. We were able to, really be sympathetic when he complained about his mother. And one day I had a new social worker. We went to her house, and so my social worker was counseling her as what are your goals and what do you want to do, and let's set some times to monitor this, et cetera, which is what programs tend to do. And her son that we knew from our program, gang programs then, was watching, and he got this look of disgust on his face. And, I'm over there because his mother's like in her 40s and my social worker's like mid-20s, and I thought it was aimed at my social worker, right? And I could kind of understand that, but we were leaving her place and going down, and she runs after us, and she grabs me by the back. She turns me around and says, "Don't come to my house again. I don't want to talk to you anymore." And she ran back. And I was flabbergasted because we had known them and we thought we'd help them and whatever. And then we heard a week later her son did join a gang, right? And so we're trying to find out what's going on. And so we're calling her and she wouldn't answer our phones, and finally got a hold of some of her friends. And we asked them, so what happened, And they said, well, what happened is after you were there, that her son called her stupid. And this is something that had been going on for a long time, that the fact that she had 3 case managers from welfare, from refugee services, from gang programs, that he felt that she was really stupid, and that he had more respect for my staff because his mother did not have a car to take him to a baseball game, didn't have the money to take him to a baseball game, didn't have money for school supplies, but we did. We were replacing her, and we had more resources to replace her. And so we cut into her authority as a parent, and she had nothing to do with us after that. So what she did is she turned back to her community and the families of refugees that had figured out how to use our system, because she didn't know how to use our school system or whatever. And she then formed this community with them that then the rest of the 2 younger kids were being raised in that, but she had lost her son. And for my mother, losing a child was, for my sister to this guy that would beat her up all the time was really awful. And for Myung, who had lost her son to a gang, was really awful. And in many ways, my programs had really undercut her parental authority. We have to show respect for parents. The fact is they are struggling, but they need the resources we often get credit for. And so to me, there is a huge flip of narrative has to happen, and we are partially at fault. And somehow or other, these conversations have to go on and have to go on much, much deeper.
So I guess the question is, middle-class folks take for granted the support systems that they and their children have. How do you create those same support systems without making them so obvious that it creates the type of difficulty that you were just explaining? And I think that really is a question for everyone here in the social service community, but perhaps you can have a final thought on that as we close up the conversation.
Well, I was having a conversation with Carrie's mom, and she asked, so then what are we supposed to do? Because in many ways, I've just said, we're kind of in the way, and we control all the resources that really they would want to have. So it is really difficult. And so in the conversation with Carol, that I was saying, in the project that you saw that I started, you saw they were being really nice to me. And what the woman said is that even though he's never done anything for me, which was really true, what's fascinating is, what we did and what we've done for those families, which is what we all could do, is we validated that they were the only experts of their own lives. And that what they were trying was probably the best thing to do. And that they should just keep going, and we'll be behind them. People have said we're like having a rich uncle. Like, if you don't screw up too much, they'll always screw up because you're part of the family. We need family. We need community. We need people that will validate that really they're the only ones that every kid is different. To have these policies and programs or, encapsulate everybody is kind of BS. So somehow or other, we have to validate, and then we have to give up control of the resources and money we have control over because we fundraised. And that is scary, because then they're going to hold us responsible. But I can tell you, when we've done it that way, because I had to fire 4 staff that started helping families, our programs will not help anybody. If you help somebody, you're gone. Because what I want to know is the talent that's already there. And what happens is that the success is much greater. But it's scary for people that want to be the helpers and are used to being in control, which is mostly people of privilege. That's what they're used to. So you'd have to get used to a different reality.
All right, and just a quick final thought on narrative. Armando talked earlier about people living in one bedroom. Think about all the politicians who will sell their brand because their grandparents came to America living in one bedroom and how they got beyond that. And that becomes an iconic story of their American dream. Yet so many people living in one bedroom never get the respect today that they deserve for being able to try and struggle their way out of that. So we're dealing with larger cultural narratives that have impact at the grassroots, and I think that's why we have to sort of really think about the storytelling and the narrative change that this is all about. So thank you very much.